May 1941, somewhere in the North Atlantic, 800 miles from the nearest airfield, a Hurrican fighter sits on the bow of a cargo ship, strapped to a rocket-powered catapult. The pilot climbs into the cockpit, knowing that when he launches there is no runway to return to, no aircraft carrier, no landing strip, just the freezing Atlantic below. If he survives the mission, he will bail out over the ocean and hope someone fishes him from the water before hypothermia kills him. This was not a suicide mission. This was British engineering at its most desperate and brilliant. The Huracut program, officially the Catapult aircraft merchantman ships, put fighters on cargo vessels too small to have flight decks. One launch per aircraft, one chance per pilot, and it worked. The men who volunteered for this knew the mathematics. A Hurrican cost the Crown roughly £5,000. A single cargo ship and its supplies were worth millions. A convoy of 30 ships carried enough food, fuel and weapons to keep Britain fighting for another week. If one expendable fighter could protect that convoy, the trade was worth making. But here is the part that seems counterintuitive. These pilots were not expendable. Many were experienced combat aviators, including some Battle of Britain veterans, and they climbed into cockpits bolted to rocket sleds, knowing they would end every mission in the sea. To understand why Britain built this impossible weapon, you need to understand what was killing her convoys. By the summer of 1940, Germany controlled the Atlantic coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. From airfields near Bordeaux, the Luftwaffe flew a 4-engine bomber that Winston Churchill called the Scourge of the Atlantic, the Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor. The Condor was a converted airliner. Before the war, it had set records flying passengers from Berlin to New York. Now it carried bombs instead of businessmen. With a range of 3,560 kilometers and an endurance of up to 18 hours, the Condor could reach convoy lanes far beyond any British fighter cover. The aircraft operated in what planners called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a zone of ocean where no land-based aircraft could protect shipping. In August and September 1940 alone, Condors sank 90,000 tons of Allied shipping. By February 1941, the cumulative total reached approximately 363,000 tons. The worst single day came on February 9th, 1941, when 5 Condors attacked convoy HG-53 and sank 5 freighters 400 miles southwest of Lisbon. The Condor did something even more dangerous than bombing. It shadowed convoys and broadcast their positions to U-boat wolf packs. A single Condor circling overhead could guide a dozen submarines onto a convoy's track. The combination of aerial reconnaissance and submarine attack was bleeding Britain white. On December 27, 1940, Churchill fired off a demand to his Chief of Naval Staff. What have you done about catapulting expendable aircraft from ships? By March 1941, he was writing with extreme priority for catapult fighters. The Admiralty had to do something, and they had to do it fast. The solution came from Captain M.S. Slattery of the Royal Navy. He proposed strapping rocket-powered catapults to the bows of merchant ships. The Royal Aircraft Establishment developed the system. A steel rail approximately 75 to 85 feet long, mounted on the port side of the forecastle, a trolley or cradle riding that rail, and a bank of 3-inch solid fuel rockets that would accelerate a fully loaded Hurrican from standstill to flying speed in under 3 seconds. The launch was violent. Sub-Lieutenant David Wright of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve described it as like sitting on an exploding bomb. The pilot applied 30 degrees of flap and 1/3 right rudder. He opened full throttle and tightened the friction nut so the throttle could not slip. He pressed his head back into a specially designed headrest to absorb the acceleration, braced his right elbow against his hip, then lowered his left hand as the launch signal. The catapult duty officer counted to 3, waited for the ship's bow to rise from a wave trough, then fired the rockets. The entire stroke lasted roughly 1 second. The aircraft either flew or it did not. 2 parallel programs operated simultaneously. 5 fighter catapult ships were Royal Navy commissioned warships, crewed by naval personnel with Fleet Air Arm pilots. Separately, 35 CAM ships were civilian cargo vessels crewed by Merchant Navy sailors, with RAF personnel from the newly formed Merchant Ship Fighter Unit, established on May 5, 1941 at RAF Speak in Liverpool. The aircraft chosen was the Hawker Hurrican Mark I, specifically surplus and war-weary airframes, many of them nearing the end of their useful lives. Authorities differ on exact conversion figures. Dozens of worn-out Mark I Hurricanes were converted specifically for CAM use as Sea Hurricane Mark IA, while broader Sea Hurricane conversions across all variants ran into the low hundreds. The Sea Hurricane Mark IA was powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin III producing 1,030 horsepower delivering a maximum speed of 316 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Armament was 8.303 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 per wing. Combat endurance was approximately 1 hour at full power. Key modifications for catapult operations included catapult spools on the rear wing spar and either side of the radiator, shackles on the front spar for crane loading, tie-down eyelets under the wingtips, a naval radio, an improved pilot headrest, a more easily jettisoned cockpit hood, and an inflatable single-man dinghy. Against the Condor, the Hurrican held every advantage that mattered. The Condor's maximum speed was just 360 km per hour at altitude, roughly 93 miles per hour slower than the Hurrican. Condor pilots were forbidden from exceeding 450 km per hour, even in dives, because the aircraft, designed as a civilian airliner, was structurally fragile. At least 8 FW-200s broke their backs on landing when the fuselage fractured aft of the wing. The Condor lacked armour, had vulnerable fuel lines, and could not perform violent evasive manoeuvres. Against a Hurricane, the Condor was fatally outclassed. From mid-1941, Condor crews were explicitly ordered to avoid all combat and flee rather than engage. Total FW-200 production amounted to only 276 aircraft across all variants. Germany could not afford to lose them in fighter combat. The 35 CAM ships included 8 privately owned vessels and 27 Ministry of War Transport Empire ships. The first CAM ship to sail was Michael E., departing with convoy OB-327 on May 28, 1941. She was torpedoed and sunk by U-108 just 5 days later. The program had barely begun, and it was already bleeding. Over the program's life, 12 of the 35 CAM ships were sunk primarily by U-boats during approximately 170 round-trip convoy voyages. As an added deception measure, 2 ships were fitted with dummy catapults and dummy aircraft in late 1941, underscoring just how much the Admiralty valued the deterrent effect. Now, before we see how this performed in combat, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British aviation, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Alright, let us get into the combat record. The full combat record of the CAM ship and fighter catapult ship program is remarkably compact. There were 8 operational combat launches from CAM ships, plus additional launches from Royal Navy fighter catapult ships. Including both programs, summaries count 8 or 9 enemy aircraft destroyed, but every single one mattered. The first kill came in early August 1941. Lieutenant Robert W. H. Everett of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve catapulted from the fighter catapult ship HMS Maplin and shot down an FW-200 Condor, expending all his ammunition in a hard-fought engagement. Everett was an extraordinary figure, an Australian-born former Royal Navy midshipman who had won the 1929 Grand National at Aintree aboard 100-1 outsider Gregorlac. He had completed the 1934 McRobertson air race from England to Australia. He volunteered for the Fleet Air Arm at age 39. After shooting down the Condor, he ditched near HMS Wanderer and was recovered. Awarded the DSO, he was killed 5 months later during a routine ferry flight near Anglesey. The first CAM ship action came on November 1st, 1941, when Flying Officer Varley launched from Empire Foam against a Condor near convoy HX-156. The Condor fled the moment it saw the flash of the catapult rockets. No shots were fired. The mere presence of the Hurricane had done the job. Varley bailed out and was recovered by destroyer HMS Broke. The program's most dramatic day was May 25, 1942. 2 CAM ship pilots launched from 2 different convoys in the same Arctic waters. Pilot Officer John Bedford Kendall, a 21-year-old Battle of Britain veteran, catapulted from Empire Morn escorting homeward-bound convoy QP-12. He drove off a BV-138 flying boat, then attacked and destroyed a Junkers Ju-88. Kendall radioed the position of the downed German crew in their rubber dinghy, a humanitarian act noted in press reports. But when Kendall tried to bail out, something went wrong. His parachute reportedly opened barely 50 feet above the water. He was pulled from the sea by destroyer HMS Badsworth within minutes, but died of his injuries. He was the only MSFU pilot killed during a combat launch. That same day, Pilot Officer Alistair Hay, a South African, launched from Empire Lawrence in nearby convoy PQ-16 against a formation of 6 Heinkel. He won 11 torpedo bombers. He destroyed 1 Heinkel and damaged another, breaking up the torpedo attack on the convoy's port column. Hay was wounded during the engagement, but not by the Germans. Investigation later revealed the shell that penetrated his cockpit had been fired by a trigger-happy American gunner on one of the freighters. He bailed out with a punctured dinghy and was picked up by HMS Volunteer within 6 minutes. The most remarkable individual performance belonged to Flying Officer A.H. Burr, who launched from Empire Morn on September 18, 1942, during operations related to the famous convoy PQ-18. He attacked a line of 15 Heinkel torpedo bombers flying at wave-top height, making 3 passes and destroying 2 aircraft. Out of ammunition, Burr continued making mock attack passes to disrupt the remaining bombers. Then, with 70 gallons of fuel remaining, his fighter direction officer gave him a vector of 180 degrees magnetic and a distance of 240 miles to Keg Ostrov Aerodrome near Archangel. Burr landed in Russia with just 5 gallons in his reserve tank. He was the only combat launch pilot to save his aircraft. The program's final combat came on July 28, 1943. German intelligence had learned the MSFU was being disbanded and sent Condors to attack convoy SL-133, confident it sailed without fighter protection. They were wrong. Empire Darwin and Empire Tide, the last 2 operational CAM ships, heading home to have their catapults removed, were aboard. Flying Officer J.A. Stewart from Empire Darwin shot down a Condor. Flying Officer P.J.R. Flynn from Empire Tide attacked and damaged another, which was last seen losing height and jettisoning bombs. The full combat scorecard: 8 German aircraft destroyed by CAM ship launches, 9 if you include fighter catapult ship kills, 4 FW-200 Condors, 4 He-111s, 1 Ju-88, at least 1 damaged, several more driven off, 8 Hurricans lost from CAM ships, 1 saved by Burr, 1 pilot killed out of 8 CAM ship combat launches. The fastest rescue took just 6 minutes, but the numbers only tell part of the story. The strategic impact of CAM ships extended far beyond the handful of confirmed kills. The program fundamentally altered German air tactics over the Atlantic. Before CAM ships appeared in mid-1941, Condors operated as aggressive low-level bombers, sinking 363,000 tons at a rate that was climbing monthly. After CAM ships joined convoys, KG-40 crews received explicit orders to stop attacking shipping and avoid all combat to preserve their dwindling aircraft numbers. The Condor was transformed overnight from a ship killer into a passive reconnaissance platform, still valuable for vectoring U-boats, but no longer directly sinking tonnage. The Swedish turnip low-level bombing technique was abandoned. When Condors were eventually forced to attack, they bombed from a minimum altitude of 9,000 feet, drastically reducing accuracy compared to their earlier 45-meter passes. The CAM ships were a bridge technology spanning the gap between total mid-ocean defenselessness in 1940 and 1941 and the arrival of escort carriers, MAC ships, and very long-range liberators in 1942 and 43. The mid-Atlantic gap was finally closed in May 1943, when RCAF liberators became operational from Newfoundland. CAM ships were phased out across 1942 to 43. The last MSFU was formally disbanded on September 7, 1943. The fundamental difference between CAM ships and their successors was recoverability. MAC ships could land and relaunch their swordfish. Escort carriers operated full air groups through repeated sorties, but in 1941, when none of these existed in sufficient numbers and Britain was losing the tonnage war, the only option was a rocket on a rail and a pilot willing to ride it. What kind of man volunteered for such duty? The MSFU recruitment specification demanded first-class chaps in combat because they operate on their own. They must be reliable and keen, have tact and initiative, and be able to engage the enemy after long periods of inactivity. They also, it noted, must be good sailors. All were volunteers. Many were experienced pilots, including some Battle of Britain veterans. Most were young, often in their early 20s, though not exclusively. The crucial psychological distinction separating CAM pilots from kamikazes was that survival was expected and planned for. Pilots carried Mae West life vests, inflatable dinghies, and sea dye markers. Escort vessels were briefed to pick them up. The primary experience for most CAM ship pilots was not combat, but crushing boredom. MSFU pilot Tim Elkington recalled filling time playing darts, card games, whittling model aircraft, eating remarkably good food, and talking by Aldous lamp with the other CAM ship pilot. Most pilots completed their 2-rotation assignment without ever launching. Of the 35 CAM ships, 12 were sunk during approximately 170 round-trip convoy voyages. 2 of the 5 fighter catapult ships were also lost. The sea claimed more ships than the Hurricats ever saved aircraft. But here is the calculation that mattered. A hurricane on a catapult changed the variables of the Atlantic War during the months when nothing else could. The pilots of the merchant ship fighter unit flew into the gap between desperation and innovation, trusting that someone below would pull them from the water. Almost all of them were right. The Huracut program proved that sometimes the impossible solution is the only solution. Britain could not build escort carriers fast enough. She could not extend the range of her patrol aircraft quickly enough. She could not stop the Condors with anti-aircraft guns or evasive routing. So she bolted fighters to cargo ships, lit the rockets, and hoped for the best. 8 or 9 aircraft destroyed is a modest scoreboard. But the Condor crews who turned away from convoys they would otherwise have bombed, the attacks not made, the ships not sunk, the cargoes that arrived, represent the program's true legacy. In the desperate mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic, a fighter that could only fly once was worth more than its weight in gold, because the supplies it protected kept Britain alive long enough to build the weapons that won the war. No CAM-launched Hurricans survive in their original catapult configuration, and no complete CAM-converted merchant ship survives as a museum ship. Some catapult fragments and photographs survive in museum collections. A memorial stands at Liverpool John Lennon Airport, the former RAF Speak, where the merchant ship fighter unit trained. The key accounts of the program survive in Ralph Barker's book, The Hurricats from 1978, and in the memoirs of the pilots themselves. James Stewart, the pilot who made the last combat launch from Empire Darwin, wrote memoirs titled Angels and Gremlins, and appeared at RAF Abingdon in 1987 carrying a model of his ship. The popular framing of CAM pilots as Britain's kamikaze pilots, used in various accounts over the years, makes for dramatic storytelling, but misses the crucial distinction. These men expected to survive. They planned to survive. The aircraft was expendable. The pilot was not. A persistent myth holds that Hurricats had their undercarriages removed to save weight. This is false. The landing gear was retained for occasions when pilots could divert to airstrips, as Burr proved over the Arctic. But for 2 years, ordinary cargo ships carried the strangest aircraft in the Royal Air Force, flown by men who accepted that every mission would end in the sea. That was British aviation in 1941. Not elegant, not efficient, but absolutely effective.